Hello everybody, Toronto here, and welcome back to our series on American tanks I would like to see added to War Thunder. This is part 3, so if you haven't seen the other episodes, I'd recommend you watch them as well, where we looked at the M6 GMC Fargo, M38 Wolfhound, M7 medium tank, and many more. For our first tank, we have the M6A2 heavy tank armed with the T7 90mm gun. Now this tank should hopefully be familiar to most of you because other than the gun, it's almost exactly the same as the recently added T1E1, which is sometimes referred to unofficially as the M6A2. For those of you who aren't familiar with the T1E1, it was added to War Thunder in the recent Sky Guardians update, and it is extremely similar to the M6A1, with the main differences being the use of a cast instead of welded hull, and the use of an electric transmission, allowing for the same max speed in reverse as well as forwards, which makes it an excellent shoot and scoot tank, and for escaping dangerous situations. Of course, unlike the T1E1 we got in the Sky Guardians update, the M6A2 is armed with the T7 90mm gun, which was the original designation for the M3 90mm gun as used on the M36 Jackson, and as such would have identical penetration characteristics, so 158mm at 500 metres with APC-BC shells. In addition to this, it retains the 37mm coaxial gun, roof-mounted 50caliber machine gun and the dual 50caliber machine guns mounted in the bow, giving this a very well-rounded selection of armaments. Now the main issue with the 90mm gun is that the turret wasn't specifically designed to mount it, so space was a bit of an issue, which might be represented by having a longer reload rate than on the other 90mm armed tanks like the T25 and M36 GMC, both of which have a reload rate of 9.7 seconds, and this is compared to the 76mm armed M6A1's reload rate of 7.67 seconds. The turret traverse and elevation might also be slowed due to the larger gun, again giving some trade-offs to the massive increase in firepower. Armour would remain the same with a maximum thickness of 101mm, while the max speed should broadly be the same at 23.1 miles per hour or 37.1 kilometers an hour, though again there may be some slowdown due to the larger gun, while the crew complement would be 6. Consisting of a driver, loader and bow machine gunner in the hull, with the commander, gunner and main gun loader in the turret. Now in real life this design, much like the M6 heavy tank in general, didn't really go anywhere, so this design never saw combat and seems to have been confined to public events in the United States, though of course it could have a shot at combat in War Thunder. So where should the M6A2 go in War Thunder? Assuming it wasn't added as a premium or event tank, I would place it between the M4A3E2 76 and the T26E5 in the heavy armour lineup, probably at a battle rating of around 5.7 to 6.0. My reasoning for this is that the next 19mm gun tank is the T25 medium tank at 6.3, but this has many advantages over the M6A2, being a faster tank, having a smaller profile, and while it does have thinner armour, the M6A2's armour is not going to be particularly great in the higher battle ratings, meaning it would have to rely on its gun and mobility, much like with the M36 Jackson, which is at battle rating 5.3. Overall, I think it would be a rather fun tank to play, as its fast forward and reverse speeds when combined with the excellent 90mm gun would allow it to be a great shoot and scoot tank, especially in urban areas, capable of laying ambushes before quickly reversing away at full speed before enemies can respond, as well as being able to quickly traverse the battlefield, and ultimately I think this would just be a very fun heavy tank for the American tech tree. Now the next tank, usually referred to as the T40/M17 Whiz-Bang, was one I didn't really pay much attention to at first when conducting research on American tanks that need adding to War Thunder. I mean, as you can see, it's an M4 Sherman with a rocket launcher on the top, so I had merely assumed it was just a different type of T-34 Calliope, and so I added it to the list of tanks to cover and quickly forgot about it. However, when I got around to doing more in-depth research on the next tanks I wanted to cover, I finally took a look at the rockets And it turns out I've been somewhat sleeping on this tank. Now, the tank itself isn't anything to get too excited about. It is essentially a 75mm M4A1 Sherman, so not brilliant but not bad either. And also the designation refers to the rocket launchers, not the tank itself, but obviously I will probably use the rocket launcher designation just for easiness. And the rocket launcher itself is a bit more interesting, or more specifically the rockets themselves, mostly on account of how much explosive filler they contain. For example, the already in-game T-34 Calliope's M8 rockets have a total weight of 38 pounds or 17.2 kilograms, but only have an explosive payload of 4.2 pounds or 1.95 kilograms. Now, the T-37 7.2-inch HE rockets, as fired from the M17 launcher mounted atop the whiz-bang, on the other hand, have a total weight of 61 pounds or 27.6 kilograms, but an explosive payload of a whopping 32 pounds or 14.5 kilograms. And honestly, I had to go and check multiple sources because I was convinced that the technical documents I was using must have meant 3.2 pounds, or that perhaps I was looking at the wrong weapon. And interestingly, we do have T-37 rockets in the game on American coastal craft in the naval tech tree, but these have a larger explosive filler which is comprised of Torpex, and so might be related to a naval variant of this rocket. Now, you might be wondering why am I so excited about how much explosive payload it has. Well, let's compare it to the other tanks in War Thunder. For example, the usual main vehicle for explosives is the KV-2, but the KV-2's HE shells only have an explosive payload of 3.83 kilograms. And in fact, as far as I can tell, the Whiz-Bang's HE rockets have a bigger explosive payload than pretty much any other ground vehicle in the game bar the premium Sturm Tiger and RBT-5, which have an explosive shell or rocket explosive content of 135 kilograms and 130 kilograms respectively. The only regular vehicles that come anywhere near the Whiz-Bang's rocket explosive payload are the 2S3M and the Type 75 SPG, whose HE shells have an explosive content of 10.12 kilograms and 9.14 kilograms respectively. Now, bear in mind, I'm not counting Hess shells or aircraft rockets like the Uncle Tom, which do have more explosive filler, but like I say, they are Hess shells or are used by aircraft, so it's a bit difficult to make direct comparisons. Now, to make things even better, the T-37 rockets use C2 plastic explosives, which I'm not entirely sure, but I suspect, like the variant with the Torpex, will probably have a higher explosive content when measured in TNT equivalent. And overall, this would likely give an armour penetration of around 70mm, maybe a little less, maybe a little more, which is kind of ridiculous, especially when you consider the launcher could hold 20 rockets, and that these rockets could be fired in under 10 seconds. Unfortunately, there is a somewhat obvious downside, in that, of course, the rockets being massive does somewhat limit their maximum range. In fact, their maximum range is only 230 yards or 210 metres, which of course will make aiming them very difficult. Not to mention the giant rockets mounted atop your tank will make a very tempting target for enemies. So how would the T-40 Whiz-Bang work in War Thunder? As much as I would like to see it added as a regular tank, for the most part rocket tanks do seem to be premium or event vehicles, and I have no doubt this would probably be the same for the Whiz-Bang, which is unfortunate but understandable. As for the battle rating, I would suggest adding it at around 4.0, the same as the Calliope and the M4A2 Sherman. My reasoning for this is that while the rockets are extremely cool, due to their limited use at anything above 100 metres, it will be extremely difficult to use, while not granting a massive advantage over the other 75mm armed Shermans. It could still have some success though, especially if someone takes the time to master the aiming of its rockets, while even novices might find success through the sheer number of powerful rockets being fired into areas known to house enemies. Overall, I think this would be a fun tank and an interesting counterpart to the Calliope, so hopefully Gaijin will see fit to add it to War Thunder in the near future. We now come to the M37 Howitzer Motor Carriage, or HMC, and this was the vehicle that was chosen to replace the M7 Priest in service. Unlike the M7 Priest, this vehicle does tend to be somewhat forgotten, in large part because by the time it was ordered it was January 1945, and it wasn't put into production until September 1945, and production ended a month later in October 1945. So it was far too late to take part in World War II. Sources differ on how many were actually produced, but the two figures that are generally bandied about are 150 or 316. Though the former does sound more realistic for barely a month or two's worth of production, this is versus around 4,300 for the M7 Priest. And so the few M37s produced ended up serving primarily in the Korean War, before being replaced by the even less well-known M52 HMC, which we will no doubt cover in a future episode. Unlike the M7 Priest, the M37 was based on the chassis of the M24 Chaffee light tank, enabling it to have a higher top speed, which is now 35 miles per hour or 56 kilometers an hour, much faster than the M7 Priest's 24 miles per hour or 39 kilometers an hour, allowing the M37 HMC to quickly relocate across the battlefield. The new chassis also makes the M37 slightly shorter in height and length, but wider than the M7 Priest, at 5.49 metres long, 2.99 metres wide and 2.84 metres tall. Like the M7 Priest, the M37 is also armed with a 105mm howitzer, though it now uses the M4 105mm howitzer instead of the M1. There wouldn't really be much of a difference in the game, except that the M4 is the same one used on the M4A3 105, and as such has been specifically designed for use in vehicles. The M4 105mm howitzer has increased elevation over the weapon used in the M7 Priest, at -10 to +45 degrees, versus the M7 Priest's -5 to +35, while traverse is a bit more of a mixed bag, being 22.5 degrees right and left, versus the M7 Priest where it is 30 degrees to the right and only 15 degrees to the left. The ammunition for the M37 is the same as the M4A3 105, meaning HE and heat shells with a maximum penetration of 130mm in-game. However, in addition to this, it was brought to my attention in the comments of the last episode that an APCB HE shell was developed for the 105mm howitzer, along with a sabot round, and as such I've done some digging and have found a little bit of information on these shells. The first, the APCB HE round, was originally designated the T24, and started off as just an APHE shell, but testing indicated the need for a ballistic cap, whereupon it was redesignated the T24E1. In this guise it was tested and shown to be capable of penetrating 3 inches or 76.2mm of face-hardened armour at a 30-degree angle from 1,260 yards or 11,152 metres, or conversely 4 inches or 101mm of armour at a 0-degree angle, presumably from the same distance. The sabot round has less information, but essentially it appears that existing 57mm and 75mm shells were able to be fired from the 105mm howitzer, achieving muzzle velocities of 2,800 and 2,100 feet a second respectively. Unfortunately, I've only seen penetration results with the 57mm M86 round at a 30-degree angle, and these actually give worse results than the T24E1 shell at 2.7 inches or 68mm, though undoubtedly it would give far greater penetration figures at flat angles. So in theory, these shells could be added to the M37 or even the earlier M7 Priest, with the T24E1 having 50,000 shells ordered, or a limited procurement, depending on the sources used. However, I've yet to find any sources stating that they were used in combat, or even issued, with the manuals I found for the M7 Priest, M37 and the later M52, usually stating that the rounds carried were some variation of HE, heat, chemical, drill, blank, white phosphorus and other minor shells. So whether we actually get these shells would rather depend on how Gaijin feels about them, unfortunately. The ammunition storage is also greatly increased, carrying 90 to 126 shells depending on the sources used, compared to only about 69 shells for the M7 Priest. In addition to the howitzer, the M37 is also equipped with one 50-caliber machine gun mounted to the right of the gun, much like on the M7 Priest. Armour as to be expected is rather light, maxing out at 13mm, made worse by the open-topped fighting compartment. This of course does lead to the M37 being vulnerable to practically everything, especially roving aircraft. So concealing yourself from aircraft and not getting into stand-up fights will be the order of the day when using this vehicle. Lastly, the crew complement was 7, consisting of a driver, machine gunner, commander, and officially 4 cannoneers, though in game this would be 3 loaders and a gunner. Interestingly, some sources do mention that the crew was increased to 8 in the 1950s by the addition of another cannoneer, though I suspect in game it would be a 7-man crew. So having looked at the M37 HMC, where should it go in War Thunder? It would depend a lot on what ammunition it is supplied with, but I suspect a minimum battle rating of 2.3, similar to what I envisioned with the M7 Priest. Though of course the M37 has an advantage in being slightly smaller, faster, and in its ability to carry more ammunition. Of course, if it has access to the APCB HE and Sabo rounds, this battle rating could be increased, perhaps to as high as 3.0. Overall, I think this would be a very fun SPG, able to cause good amounts of damage in an ambush role, and maybe even in an artillery role, for some especially skilled players. And I think it would be nice to see this often forgotten weapon given some recognition within War Thunder. So that's it for this week's episode on American tanks. I'd be interested to hear your views on these tanks, as well as suggestions for other American tanks you'd like me to cover in the future. I look forward to reading your comments below. So I hope you've enjoyed the video, hopefully you'll join me for the next one. I've been Terreno, and I'll see you next time.